Welcome to the AIOps Evolution Weekly broadcast, a series on the integration of artificial intelligence in the ever-evolving IT ops landscape. Discover how AIOps is transforming operations to create flow in organizations. And remember to join the AIOps Evolution community to stay connected and subscribe to the show at AIOpsevolution.com. Now, let's join our hosts, Sean McDermott and Bill Driscoll, IT thought leaders, visionaries, and the voices on the other end of the mic for the latest episode of AIOps Evolution Weekly.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's AIOps Evolution Weekly. I'm your host, Sean McDermott, my co-host, Bill Driscoll. Bill, how you doing this week?
Doing well. How about yourself, Sean?
Good. You got any plans this weekend?
No, it's kind of quiet. My wife was out of town for about 9 days visiting family, and she came back last weekend. So I'm excited to kind of co-parent again instead of chasing teenage girls all over the place. I hope it's quieter than the previous 2 weekends.
Yeah, all my girls are in college, so I'm just I'm focused on getting them out of college, and not back home, just getting them out of college.
That's right. That's right.
But yeah, nothing really good, nothing big planned this weekend. So cool. So based on that, incredibly engaging conversation. How about
we could talk about shipping containers? Stranded everywhere, but I don't think.
Oh,
that's
I saw
the
that. Yeah, I saw an
broadcast.
article on it. I didn't get a chance to read it. I saw kind of the headline. It's like LA port is just like piled up with shipping containers. So, but let's talk AIOps. So, a few articles today. I came across one on Facebook, and I normally, we kind of have a policy here on the show that we don't really endorse technologies, and this is not an endorsement of Facebook at all. And if you want to know my opinions of Facebook, we can have a whole other conversation on that. But what was interesting about this article, it got more and more interesting. What I'm trying to do too is I'm trying to find interesting topics in AI and how they might be related to AIOps, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought this one, when I started reading it, it got more and more interesting. So this one is called Facebook quietly acquires synthetic data startup ai.reverie, and it's written by Kyle Wiggers at VentureBeat. So what ai.reverie basically is a company that provides synthetic data for AI modeling. And it's so they were acquired by Facebook. First thing was so they were acquired by Facebook through a company called Dolores Acquisition Sub, which I base is some reference to Westworld. And I haven't watched Westworld, but it's all about robots and AI. So I thought that was super.
I loved it.
That was a little creepy. I mean, I'll give them that. And it's kind of interesting how they acquired under another name, but that actually isn't that uncommon. Like when my last company got acquired, the acquirer actually acquired under a different name and then rolled it in later. I don't know exactly why they do that. It's from like accounting perspective or something. But anyways, so what these guys do is they create synthetic testing data, and and they've been doing this since 2017. There's also a funny thing in the article is they have a long history with the government, doing work with the government. I'm like, they only been founded like 4 years ago, so how long of a history is that? But they've got some pretty big contracts with the government, with like the Air Force and stuff like that. But why I found this thing interesting is because Facebook is going out there and basically buying this company to create synthetic data, and it might be images or text or anything like that to speed up their AI modeling. And one of the things, which is what I found, kind of intriguing about this, was that part of the reason that they think they might be doing is because of data privacy. And they, they're under a lot of pressure not to use people's data, and people are opting out of data sharing, and they need more data to do modeling and create these AI models, and they don't actually have access to it. And there's a lot of pushback on data privacy. But where this kind of got intriguing for me is the applicability of this in the operations world. And we in operations world have used synthetic data all the time, right? For event handling, event management, stuff like that. And, I remember back when I started my first consulting company, we were basically trying to build management systems for large scale networks. And if you didn't have access to a large scale network, you had to replicate it somehow. So we use all kinds of simulation applications and things like that could generate raw data and essentially simulate massive amounts of data coming into these platforms, and how we would build the rule sets and things like that. So this is interesting because in the AI ops world, you can now look at companies that might be able to generate synthetic transactions for you too, and synthetic data, so that you can actually do more and more testing on your AI ops models, and not just rely on historical data that you may not have a lot of at scale.
Yeah.
So, did you get a chance to read this article?
I did, yeah, and I guess just specifically about Facebook to start with, I think they pointed to a couple of things. One is that this sort of shows that even a company like Facebook with vast data still has gaps in their ability to collect the data. I don't know if I buy that so much. I think they collect an awful lot of data, and I don't know if the synthetic. I'm sort of skeptical that the synthetics system is getting them data that they don't have real world. I mean, I think it's more about privacy, like you said. I think that they want to be able to have options to turn off, collection if they're forced to collect and store this data and run it through algorithms, and have another option, which is the synthetic data. And so, that's kind of my comment on Facebook and kind of why they bought it. I think it's more about privacy and where things are going. I think the parallel to AIOps that I saw was a few weeks ago we highlighted some articles that talk about kind of community or industry learning models, and sort of you take your network and a lot of peer networks, and you could have load data, raw data, clean data up into sort of industry learning models, and now you can start to leverage that because you're not the only one using VMware ESX, servers, or, you're not the only one using Amazon and cloud and Microsoft and Cisco and whatnot. That there's, other companies have built machine learning models that kind of know when there's issues happening. So you should be able to use those models from the market, right? Or from community kind of space, and buy those models and download those models. And I think there's a lot of market for synthetic kind of simulation, synthetic data that sort of can supply a lot of that sort of general machine learning that you can buy the model, right? And so, and I think that companies not needing to, what I'm curious about is how much of this is based on real world, right? Is it taking real world, doing some scrubbing, and then creating the synthetic data? I'm sure it's something like that, and I think that has a lot of applicability to the AI ops world, especially as you look at companies being able to kind of leverage across technologies and across companies to be able to build better models.
Yeah, I think back to your original point about gaps. They actually, there's a quote here and says the acquisition also highlights that even a company like Facebook, which is known for its vast data, still has gaps in their ability to collect the data needed to train AI. And yeah, so if you took that at face value, then if Facebook still has gaps, then operations teams absolutely need to will have gaps, right? And they may not even have the data. So how do you start training when you don't have the data? And this may speed up things, right? Because we've talked in the past about needing sometimes months and months to have enough data to continue to train these AI models. But there's also a kind of an interesting point in the back where they're talking about some of their work with the government, kind of pulling back, my comment earlier. And they said that sometimes, some of these government organizations have issues getting access to data because the source data is remote or unavailable. So think maps and images and things like that coming out of the battlefield. Think Afghanistan, to the top of everybody's mind. We don't have enough information there anymore, right? And we don't have feet on the ground. Yet, the Biden administration said that we have over the horizon capabilities. You would think that that's probably a fair amount of AI going on there, trying to figure out, okay, how do we triangulate data and build models to understand an area that we don't fully understand in real time. So, and I think that has a lot of applicability in the operations. Is like you're going to deploy a new application. How do you model an application if you haven't actually deployed it yet. So
Mm-hmm.
I think these synthetic, and it does talk about that there's a number of companies out there that are do this type. They're not the only ones that create synthetic transaction. There's some people who basically take the counterpoint. This synthetic transaction is really not all that useful. But I thought it was an interesting subject, and I thought that take Facebook out of it. The idea of bringing in synthetic data into the operations environment to speed up and make more accurate AI models is pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. I always thought, when you were kind of battle management systems, I was always read about systems that kind of see around corners, and it's always baffled me as to how can you do that? And reminds me of my friend who couldn't understand the magnetic like levitating trains, and he's like, "That's impossible. It doesn't work." And I said, technology doesn't wait for you to understand it. It keeps going. So yeah, it's amazing. This is just peeking, kind of looking under the covers as to this article as to probably some pretty impressive things happening.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so moving on, I think you had an article you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I did. It was really about a term that I don't think either one of us had heard of before, came across before, and we actually did some searches, and I don't think it's a widely used term, so we'll see if it takes hold. But the title of the article is "Filling the Gaps with Knowledge Discovery Frameworks," and it really just said what a knowledge discovery framework is really systems that sit in a spot between automation, data analysis, artificial intelligence, and what they say service software, or really, I think, more workflow type of software. And they quote, there's actually quotes up front from Logic Monitor, which is a product we know about, and ServiceNow, we obviously know about. And as you get into it, it's really talking about providing information in the context of workflows and the context of processes, and really that support business outcomes that's useful in the moment. That's really knowledge that can be used, whether it's knowledge used by algorithms or virtual agents, or it's knowledge used by a support desk people or operation systems folks, and really that's this kind of actionable, really, knowledge discovery framework is sort of a term that was used in this article to describe a lot of what these products are doing, which is really about bringing that data up in meaningful, actionable, kind of business-centric outcomes, and really supporting workflows. And so I think they highlight at the end 3 different vendors: ONA, Microsoft Viva, and Care Knowledgeware that we haven't worked with, that really are in this space of sort of knowledge frameworks. But they're all really around employee experience, customer experience management. And I think in that case, that is where you really want to surface knowledge, using AI, using kind of what's going on, what's the context, what's the problem, what's the CIs maybe involved, and bring that knowledge up in the right context at the right time to either the customer or either the employee. And so, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, or have you come across this term before, Sean?
I have not come across this term before, and I'm not sure it actually is a term because they call it knowledge. I'm sorry, knowledge discovery frameworks, but it's not capitalized and there's no acronym. So
Okay.
I will tell you that I really struggled with this article trying to kind of figure out what exactly it was all about. And I read it probably 3 times, and it doesn't seem to me that those applications that you talked about, yeah, they're very customer centric. But to me, I guess this knowledge discovery framework seemed to me just kind of very generic thing around how to data collect and democratize data, make it available to a number, to different constituents. So I don't really have much to add to it because like I said, I kind of struggled as to try and figure out what was kind of new about this, other than maybe just trying to highlight a couple vendors. And but I think that in the end, I think that probably the most interesting statement of the whole thing was really the upfront, like first paragraph, right? And like you said, sitting in the sweet spot between automation, data analysis, artificial intelligence, and service software. And to me, that is a whole combination of what we've been talking about for weeks, right? And that is, data ingestion is key to AIOps, right? And you have to be able to find the right sources, ingest the data, get it into a format, and translate it into a way where it can be aggregated together and sent through the AI models So if that's what knowledge discovery frameworks is, that's cool stuff. If it's auto discovery of data sources, that's even cooler, right? And I know that, in talking with some of the vendors that we're going to be highlighting during our AIOps Evolution podcast season 2, shameless plug, there are some of those vendors that are really trying to figure that out. Like, how can we make the discovery of data sources better? How can we auto translate those data, the data structure into a more normalized topology for consumption into the system, and how do we then use that in our AI models? So, interesting.
Yeah.
We learned a new term today.
if it is going to be a term.
Well,
But
I Googled it and I couldn't find anything about it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
like I said, I think it's more generic of a concept and not necessarily a term.
Well, one comment, we met with we had a late night meeting last night with some folks from Asia, I think in the Philippines, and who run a CMDB for a large company, and they brought up a lot of their efforts to really get the CMDB populated and get information, but they said they have a challenge of demand, that the process owners and the users that would use that data aren't demanding this information to be in the CMDB. They're using their own systems, right, they're closer to the source. And so I think tying that back to this article is, we talked about how do you generate that demand, and it really has to be what knowledge can you provide people, these users, that you can get out of the CMDB versus these other systems that are going to really help them in their job, versus feeling like it's just a data collection and data storage challenge. It's got to really fall back into knowledge for the people doing the process and the business and people side of things versus just a data exercise.
Yeah, you and I had a whole conversation on this like a couple of weeks ago, right? About CMDB and what actually goes into the CMDB and how hard it is to keep it, and how do you replicate it, or do you federate CMDB? But I think, touching on your point, in the end, it all comes back to who needs access to the data at what time to answer what question.
That's exactly right. Yep.
And, it's not surprising to me. So people be like, I don't really care that the data is in the CMDB or not. That's irrelevant to me. I'm just trying to answer. Trying to answer a question. Yep. If it's in the CMDB, great. If it's CMDB is not accessible to me, then it's no use.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Yep.
Cool. So now that we're talking about data, you want to talk about data lakes?
Yes. We'll take a swim in one. Let's go.
Take a swim in a data lake.
Now that it's getting cold.
Not in here in Florida. It's awesome. I got my little Florida hat on today. It's like prime weather right now. I think it's like 80 degrees and sunny. So, nice. Okay. So let's talk about data lakes. So there's an article here from Tech Heiress, Evan Morris wrote this, and it's called Data Lakes: 5 Key Challenges for Enterprises and How to Overcome Them. So I know you had a chance to read this because we talked about it before the show, but kind of 3 or 5 major key challenges. And one is the challenge of data ingestion, the challenge of data portability, the challenge of data speed and data quality, challenge of democratizing access to data insights, and the challenge of standardizing data governance. So for me, there's a couple big takeaways here. And it all kind of goes back to the article ends called Advanced Planning Can Help You Overcome Data Challenges. I think advanced planning and just about anything can help you in the long run. But when I look at this area, they talk about, he kind of starts off the article talking about one of the most critical steps in driving data-led culture is moving data from storage and processing to the cloud. We do a lot of work around, migrating to the cloud and migrating large data sets to the cloud. So I 100% agree that it's a big challenge, and it has to be well thought out. And of all the things that he talks about in here, the couple things that really stuck out to me. One is that whatever cloud provider you go to, it's pretty sticky, right? So you want to make sure that you really think about where you want this data housed and how much data you're going to move, because once it goes there, it could be onerous to get it back out and migrate it. So you probably want to think long and hard about where you're putting this data in the cloud, what provider you're using, and how strategic that provider is to your business. because you probably, if you make a decision to move cloud providers, you probably are going to be going through a pretty massive transformation again. The second thing that kind of stuck to me here was really about democratizing data. And I think we've talked about this in the past. And one of the things is that if it's hard to get at the data, it's just as useless. Like kind of back to the CMDB discussion, it may be, the data may be in the CMDB, but if I can't get access to it, then it's useless to me. And so looking at no code solutions, low code solutions that people can use to get access to that data to get the insights they need is really key. And there's just a lot of technology out there now that you can take advantage for low code or no code. Because if you make it too much of a effort to build insights using more complex visualization methodologies or systems, you're going to they're not going to have the technical expertise to do it, or you're going to have to go back to IT, and then IT is already burdened and you're just going to be waiting. And then the question might be irrelevant that you're trying to answer if you wait too long for the answer. And the last thing is thinking about security, right? And how do you secure this data and make sure that it's accessible only by the right people at the right times. So, and so these are kind of, to me, those are kind of three big things I took out of this. What about you?
Yeah, I think this article is relevant because data lakes and historical data is very much an important aspect of IT operations, right? A lot of there are less mature companies, or I guess smaller companies, that they go in and buy a monitoring, observability system, event management, ticketing system, but it's all sort of real time management, and then there's maybe some high level information that gets stored so you can kind of get reports out of your ServiceNow system or your event management system. I think that most large enterprises, or almost all, have recognized that you do want to store this data for long-term usage, right? It isn't just something the next day you don't really need it, other than outage information, for example. You do want to do some analysis, and I think everything in here, all these challenges really apply to those operational data store data lakes, not just general sort of business data warehouses or data lakes. So without going into real time, democratizing access, standardizing data governance, these are all challenges that you see across any data lake, and especially an operations data lake. As I read this article, I just started thinking, well, why do a lot of customers have challenges with investing in this, and what's the business case? And really, I think it comes down to three different areas and uses for these data lakes. One is you got to be able to measure key metrics, right? Your mean time to restore and detect, and overall availability and performance of application. And you want to see those trends of sort of performance and how the business is doing, or how your IT services are doing over a long time. The second area is democratizing access, right? I think there's a use case just recently of the service desk is getting calls from customers, and they need to be able to say, haven't we had 3 outages before? Or what is our data? What does the performance look like over the last 60 days? And the service desk, the NOC, or whoever's interfacing with the customer, they need to be able to pull that report up and share that with the customer. They got to be able to see that historical data, and you've got to put that information in the hands of the users. And then the last area, which I think is sort of the newer up and coming area, is just in really AIOps and machine learning algorithms. And if you don't have this data, and you don't have synthetic data like we talked about with Facebook, you're not really going to be able to do the machine learning that you need and start applying those algorithms. And there's more and more technologies out there that you can kind of apply to that data lake, and start to learn these things, and then feed that back into how you're doing event management, and how you're setting thresholds, and how you're driving and uncovering automations that you could do. So those are 3 key reasons as to why customers should be interested in this. And if you're interested in this, you got to be able to understand the challenges you're getting into with the data lake.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really great point, and the one I'm glad you did, and that was, what does all this mean to AI ops, right? And if you look at it from someone who's trying to deploy an AI ops strategy today, you've got a lot of data out there, probably sitting in different places. How do you aggregate this data and move it into the cloud, and move it into a cloud-based data lake? And why do you need to do that? Is because your AI ops models need this historical data, right? Because one of the things that AI ops is really good at is looking at dynamic thresholding and understanding patterns of usage
Mm-hmm.
and patterns of performance, so you can detect whether you have a problem that needs addressing or doesn't based on historical performance. So if you're seeing, if the AIOps solution platform is seeing a spike, it can look at historical data and say, well, wait a minute, we see this spike same time every single day.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily an outage, predicting an outage. It's a normal course of how this application runs and the demand on it at this period of time. So if you don't have that historical data, and you don't have that historical data in a place where the AIOps platform can access it, then you really are limiting a pretty big use case around your AIOps platform. So,
Yeah.
but you got to get the data into a place. You got to be able to store it. You got to be able to make it accessible. So there's lots of ways of this data can be used, both in AI and non-AI situations. So I thought this was a pretty good article. I thought they, these five things to think about were pretty
Yeah.
spot on.
And one last thing I'll just add, because we keep reminding each other of things, is
You sound like Steve Jobs here. One last thing.
One last thing again. But the dynamic thresholding, right? I think real-time systems can kind of baseline single metrics, right, and time-based data, and kind of establish the baseline and set up some sort of dynamic thresholding. But when you're dealing with multiple metrics, like even hundreds of metrics, and trying to look for correlations across those, it's almost a mathematical impossible problem, at least that I haven't seen in performance management systems, to do that in real time. And so I think that's where you store it in the historical data. You can run these models that are really learning and looking for those correlations and saying, oh, these metrics are actually correlated, or these parts of my system are actually correlated. And then you can feed those back in to have more intelligent sort of anomaly detection in your real-time system. So, it's I think what you can do real time, or what you can do offline, is much more powerful than what you can do real time.
Yeah, and I think that this goes back to a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago about correlation of data, and I think we talked about this idea. And it was a live use case of cloud performance to order management to weather patterns, and that this is why building data lakes on an enterprise level makes a lot of sense. That it really has to be an enterprise strategy, because your operations environment will be so much better when it has contextual information coming from different sources. So you may be collecting a whole bunch of information, historical information of your order management system, but if it's sitting out on a server somewhere that's not accessible by the AIOps platform, then it's useless to the AIOps platform because they can't use it for contextual correlation. But if you can move, and if you have an enterprise strategy on an enterprise data lake, and you can move some of this business data into that data lake where it's accessible from the AIOps platform, then you start having a much more seamless correlation of data. So these data lakes are really should be looked at it from an enterprise perspective, not just in the narrow lens of operations.
Yep, completely agree.
Cool. Well, I think that's it for the week. Got anything else you want to bring up? Anything exciting?
No, not one more thing.
Not one more thing.
Not one more thing. But
well, Apple dropped a whole bunch of stuff this week, so that was exciting. New MacBooks, new AirPods, and
you buying it all?
No, I'm not actually buying any of it. So which is a shock, right? Because I buy all Apple stuff, but I don't need a new laptop. I kind of got used to my AirPod Pros, so I don't need another pair of those. But
yeah,
it's always exciting to see what they drop.
I think 3 times this weekend I got texts from my daughter's friends saying, "I'm texting you because my daughter, I won't say her name, but you can't find her phone." So like 3 times I had a scare of, we're going to be buying another iPhone, but unfortunately we didn't have to do that. So she found.
Well, my daughter lost her phone, which was in her Louis Vuitton bag, and with her car keys and her wallet and everything else like that. And she's at college in Virginia, and she's like Inspector Clouseau, man. She went after every single angle I handed to her. She was not giving up, and she actually figured out triangulated where she thought she might have lost it, and she actually went to there and put up flyers. And like 4 days later, the security campus security called her and said that they found it. Somebody turned it in, and it had all her stuff in there and her phone and everything. So it was crazy. So
it's a first world success story.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, have a great weekend, and we'll catch up again next week, as we always do. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in this week. And I want to thank our sponsor, Windward Consulting Group. You can find Windward at www.windward, W-I-N-D, windward.com. Windward is the global leader in AIOps, and they sponsor this broadcast. So check them out if you can. And Bill, thanks a lot for your time, and we will see everybody next week. Take care.
See you next week.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation about AIOps and the future of IT operations. Interested in a deeper dive on these topics? Check out our resources available at AIOpsevolution.com. And remember to subscribe to get the latest episode.